Welcome to Aspen Affairs and ACRA's 2022 Election Forum Series. I'm Alycin Bektesh, Public Affairs Manager with the Aspen Chamber Resort Association. Today we'll be discussing Ballot Measure 2A, which is a short-term rental tax, asking the citizens of Aspen, shall the City of Aspen taxes be increased by not more than $9.1 million commencing May 1st, 2023, and by whatever amounts are generated annually thereafter by the imposition of an excise tax not more than 10% on a nightly charge for any accommodations that are required to obtain a short-term rental permit. There are then three different bullet points: that a lodge-exempt property and an owner-occupied unit will both be taxed at 5%, and second homeowner investment properties at 10%. 70% of that revenue should go to the purpose of funding affordable housing, with the remainder going to infrastructure maintenance and repair and environmental initiatives. To discuss this measure, I have with me today Donnie Lee, the General Manager of The Gant. Donnie, thanks so much for coming and speaking about this.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
It's a complicated topic.
It is.
So I want to start with a quick position statement from you so we understand where you're coming from, and then I'm going to dive deeper into some of the specifics. What is your position on Ballot Measure 2A?
Thank you. It's good to be here. My position is that the condominiums should be excluded from this measure. The condominiums make up a large portion of the traditional lodging base, the hotels and the condominiums combined. They have for over 50 years, and they're not really what's driving the demands. And so from my standpoint, they need to be excluded from this. So again, I think we're trying to solve the right problem. I just think we're using the wrong solution.
Okay, fantastic. We're going to get some definitions in here. So the qualm is not the tax on short-term rentals,
right,
but the inclusion of these historic condominium properties in it. Can we define what you mean when you say condominium?
Yep. So everything from the Gant, Aspen Square, properties that are managed by Fry's Properties that have been historical lodging properties for 50 years. They were built with lodging in mind back in the day. They've been here longer than the St. Regis. They've been here longer than the Little Nell. And so, again, as part of that lodging base, they haven't fundamentally changed their business. We don't really have more employees today than we had 30 years ago. We don't really have more rooms to rent than we had 30 years ago. So the demands that we're all feeling as a community, we acknowledge. It's just not coming from here. So to tax just that piece of the lodging community doesn't make sense. Why wouldn't we tax the fractional ownership? Why wouldn't we just go ahead and create a tax that, if we want to do a lodging tax to fund employee housing, then let's do it together. Let's do something that's more equitable. Then let's put pressure where the growth is happening.
So the Gants, people can individually own the units.
Yes.
And from the beginning, the idea was that you would individually own the units, but mostly they would be rented out to Aspen's guests day in and day out.
Absolutely. So to use Aspen Square as an example, the Gant as an example, these properties were built with lodging in mind, and they provide lodge-type amenities. We acknowledge that. So for the most part, out of we have units there that don't rent. The mix of units that rent and don't rent has pretty much stayed the same, plus or minus a range of, say, 5 units up and down for 50 years. It's a program that works. It's a program that has supported the hotel lodging community as well as the community itself in a number of ways for that period of time.
You spoke about a new tax would add some confusion or varying levels to properties that have always been used as guest accommodations. Right. Can you talk about what do you mean there'd be varying tax levels?
So what's being proposed right now fractures our lodging community, and that's one of the reasons I'm in opposition to it. Okay. So you've got, as an example, Aspen Square is going to rent a room at X amount, and Limelight's going to rent a room at X amount, but there's going to be 2 different tax levels. So from a consumer standpoint, they're going to pay different amounts just based on the tax level. And they're basically still doing the same thing. So again, I just don't think we're landing this tax where it needs to be landed. I think part of it is going the right place, but there's this unintended consequence, or maybe it's an intentional consequence. There's collateral damage because we're including properties that aren't generating the demand.
Excellent, thank you. So, like, if you are coming to stay in Aspen, you're saying you'd be shopping around. Limelight has a room for $100. Right. The Square does. I know I'm being very easy with my math and unpractical with my amounts right there. But then you go to check out, and all of a sudden at the Square, your total is
X and Y,
which is more than
else.
Your total at the Limelight.
Exactly.
So it might cause this unintended consequence of guests choosing the cheaper option, which is our hotel lodges, not the properties that have always acted as lodges.
Right.
Okay, or start looking for short-term rentals in residential areas.
Right. So all of a sudden it creates this unfair burden and competition within our own lodging community, not to mention Snowmass or other destinations.
So using that same example, one thing I've heard City Council speak about is that those condos pay property tax, the hotels pay commercial tax. So when we're looking at that amount, it would be a little bit more to the consumer, but you pay property tax. What is going on with that kind of tax narrative?
Thank you for bringing it up. So there's a narrative out there that the condominiums have had an unfair advantage, that they haven't paid commercial tax rates, but they've been operating commercially.
Okay.
That we haven't necessarily paid our way, and I understand how that can be perceived. It's just not supported by the facts. It's not actually the case. So give me a minute. It's going to take a little minute to kind of unwind this. So there are commercial tax rates, and then there are residential tax rates. Some of what I've heard is, well, if you took the residential values and then applied the commercial tax rate, they'd pay 3 times more. That's not actually how it works. And if it did work that way, we would be paying way too much in taxes.
Okay.
The disparity is not 3 times. So in other words, as an example, the St. Regis doesn't pay 3 times more in property tax than the Gant does. That's not the delta. Part of that is because the way properties are valued is different. So there's commercial values and then there's residential values. Then the formula gets taken out. So it's actually much closer than you'd think. Also, we pay into the real estate transfer tax, which funds employee housing. And have been doing that since 1979. So if you add those two things together, now the taxes are actually very close. So you actually have to look at all the taxes that are being paid. So I disagree that there's an inequity. I totally understand the argument. If we're talking about a house in the west end of Aspen that's now operating as a commercial property, I get it. I understand the argument of what they're trying to do. But when we start talking about these conventional properties that have been part of the lodging base, it really doesn't add up. So to kind of reiterate that, the narrative that we're not paying our way just isn't accurate. We pay, the Gant, as an example, actually pays more in property taxes than most of the hotels in town, except for like the St. Regis and probably the Little Nell.
Okay.
But so it's a lot, and that's fine. There's no argument for that. But the narrative that somehow it's inequitable doesn't make sense. The St. Regis, as an example, is far larger, far more employees, far more impacts, and so there's an equitability to this process. I understand there's 2 different formulas going on, and it can be confusing. But when you really take a look at what's actually being paid, and then you add the real estate transfer taxes that are funding APCHA already and employee housing, because that's one of the other arguments, right? We haven't mitigated for our employees. The Gant, along with Frias and everybody else, we have a lot of employee housing. We actually do mitigate for our employees, and we pay the real estate transfer tax. So the argument that we're not paying our way really isn't supported by the facts.
And just the timeline of it all, this ballot measure is coming to the public based on a moratorium that put a halt on short-term rentals because we are seeing more and more impacts to our workforce and to our residential areas. It was not brought up, hey, we've noticed an inequity in taxes, and so how can we make a ballot measure that would equalize this? And I'm saying that, understanding your argument that perhaps that doesn't even need equalizing. This tax justification kind of came out afterwards when the process started with how can we make sure short-term rentals aren't degrading our community?
Yeah, there's been some narrative over the past few years that there was an inequity with people that were doing short-term rentals, but it was really focused more on the house, not the project. And so I agree, it kind of came in the back door to kind of support the process. And I get that it can be confusing, but I think the important thing, it's an opportunity, quite frankly, for the condominium community to kind of come back and say, wait a minute, guys, let's step back a second and remind the community all the contributions that we've actually made to the community. One, we are paying our way, so that's important to know. Two, we work with all the nonprofits, the music associates to help put on the music festival. We work with ACRA to help put on Food and Wine. We work with the ski company for World Cup events and X Games. I mean, we're contributing the same way the hotels would. If we have a problem and we think we need funding for employee housing, and we don't disagree that there's an issue.
Okay.
We just think it's the wrong solution, and we'd like to correct it. And we have time to fix it. So we as a community need to come together and say, look, let's put a tax that's equitable, be it a lodging tax or a general tax, to help fund what we need for the additional employee housing. Let's put pressure where the growth is actually occurring and not create this kind of collateral damage and fracture the lodging community. That's our position.
Okay.
We have time to fix this. Nothing would go into effect until May 1st. Let's vote now. But let's vote now. Let's vote no today.
Now.
Yeah, let's vote now. Let's vote no today on this. Let's come back in March with one that makes sense and still implement something in May to get us where we want to get to. But let's do it collectively. Let's not cherry pick a portion of the lodging community, tax them at a different rate than the hotels and the fractionals. Let's expand that out. Let's do it the right way that supports our community. I mean, if there's ever a time we need to come together, it's now. Let's not create more separation. Let's do this in a way that makes more sense.
I want to get to employee mitigation and housing in two different angles, because what we have seen over time is something that was rented to locals but was on the free market. It became so much more lucrative to instead turn that into a business, make it short-term rentals. So those locals lost their housing. Then on the other side, when you do turn that to a business, now all of a sudden you need a staff. So you're creating new jobs in town, and those people need to live somewhere. So the conversion of something that was a rental to locals to a short term, it's kind of twofold, the ways that you are affecting affordable housing, which this tax is saying 70% should go to affordable housing. The Gant didn't used to house locals, and now it's housing visitors.
Correct. The traditional condominiums that I'm referring to that need to be stepped out of this never were part of employee housing and never really housed locals. So the projects that we're talking about have always been part of the traditional lodging. The narrative that's being used is really the property tax inequity. It really doesn't exist. It's easy to look at that and say that it does, but when you really look at the data, it just doesn't support that narrative, and that's why I think it needs to be pulled out. We agree that there are other properties that did used to rent locally, now are doing short term. That's a consequence. We understand putting pressure there. We understand some of these other things. There's a lot of dynamics that are creating the pressures. First of all, it was actually the condominium community, Chuck Fry specifically, that first brought this up 10 years ago.
Wow.
To say, look, guys, there's a growing segment that's here that's not really on the same footing. We're confronting the same phenomenon. Mm-hmm. We're looking for employees. We're looking for, so we're confronting it as well. So we shouldn't be penalized for the solution when we're confronting the same battle. We agree that we need to solve that issue. But the other piece of this puzzle that's being left out, and it has nothing to do with this tax, but quite frankly, a lot of the second homes that used to be dark are now light. Mm-hmm. And they want services. Mm-hmm. So we've got property management companies and more demands for employees and services and landscaping and construction projects and cleaning services and the like and they're not renting, they're just occupying. That's a big piece of the puzzle. But then you've got another segment that is renting, mm-hmm. and that creates more demand. So there's a lot to this. We agree that there's an issue. We agree that we need to solve the issue. We agree in funding more employee housing. We just think this is the wrong solution to get there and that the condominiums need to be pulled out of that.
Okay. Because to clarify, so either the families that have now come to live here more time or full time and are bringing in staff,
Yeah.
that's new employees, plus the
Yep.
former residences that are now short-term rentals and they need employees. So there's new people who might need housing. Did you hire? Have you been hiring more and more employees? Are you creating more employees recently?
No, we really are fundamentally the same size as we always have been. And Frias and Aspen Square, again, these properties have been functioning as a lodge. We haven't doubled our staff size. We don't have double the rooms. You know, the other thing that's important to note is that we're not the only community confronting this, right? A lot of communities are confronting this, and a lot of communities are trying to do similar things. But other communities have been creative, and they've relabeled the condominiums as resort accommodations and taken them out of the short-term conversation completely. That was a smart move. So there's examples out there of what we can do and kind of follow that suit so that we, again, apply the tax and the pressure where it needs to be applied. And if that's insufficient funding in and of itself for the employee housing, then let's do a tax, either citywide or a new lodging tax, something that's equitable that everybody pays into that gets us to where we need to get to.
The tax itself, as we get into these nuances, feels pretty dense, whereas the term, the title of it, short-term rental tax, feels pretty obvious. I think there's universal acceptance that those residences, the guests who come are changing the nature and community of neighborhoods.
Sure.
The
Absolutely.
extra traffic, the extra workers, all of that. So are people aware, really, of what they're being asked come fall?
I don't know, but that's why I'm grateful for the opportunity to say, wait a minute, I think some are and some aren't.
Okay.
But this is a good opportunity for us to be able to say, this is really what's being asked. Part of it's right. We think part of it's wrong. Again, that's why we think the solution's wrong. I think we're trying to address the right problem. We think there's a better way to do it. And we would just ask to get informed that it includes some things that really shouldn't be there, in our opinion, in my opinion. And so we would ask you to vote no now, and let's come back and do something that makes sense for the community as a whole to get us where we need to get to.
Are there any other talking points that you want to make sure we hit while we're discussing the short-term rental?
I could probably go on, but I might repeat myself. No, I applaud the effort. It's the right problem to address. I just think we're doing it the wrong way. And I think there's a better way for us to do it. I think we can come together as a community and attack this problem in a way that gets us to where we need to get to without fractionalizing the lodging community, particularly the lodging community that's been here for a long time. I understand the narrative that's being thrown out there that the condominiums aren't paying their way and that we're just kind of sitting back and enjoying the benefits. That's not really the case. And so one is to correct that narrative. That's really not supported by the numbers, by the facts. And we've been contributing for many, many years, and we'll continue to do so. And we're just as passionate and caring about our community as everybody else. We just think there's a better way to solve this problem.
Donnie Lee, General Manager of The Gant, thank you so much for coming in and sharing that perspective on this upcoming ballot measure.
Thank you. Appreciate your time.